Hey everyone, it's Ricky Flores of the Margo Ricky team with Sotheby's, and in today's video, we're going to be diving into some important changes taking effect starting August 13th as a direct result of the Sitzer versus NAR lawsuit. This is important for both buyers and sellers, so please watch the video in its entirety. You can also share this video with friends, family, and colleagues who you think might like to know what's going on in the real estate world. First and foremost, let's talk about broker compensation agreements, since they are now a requirement to be signed before buyers can be shown property. That's right. As of August 13th, 2024, buyers working with agents will now have to have a BRCA form signed before they can show properties outside of an open house. What is a buyer-broker compensation agreement? I would say think of it as similar to when a seller signs a listing agreement with an agent to represent them on the sale of the house. The BRCA form works in the same way for buyers. In the form, it specifies the agency relationship between the buyer or buyers, the agent or agents, and the brokerage. For example, Jane and John Doe working with Ricky Flores of Golden Gate Sotheby's International Realty. The agreement can only be signed for a term of less than 3 months. It specifies the amount of compensation the buyer's broker will receive from the buyer at close of escrow, along with a variety of boilerplate disclosures. This is important because as we discuss the next big change, the term in the BRCA will come into play. The next big change I'll be talking about is likely the one you've heard the most about and has been the most polarizing and misrepresented topic in my opinion. Buyers, agents, compensation, and MLS. I'll talk about what the changes mean for buyers and sellers along with some pros and cons as well. Now when it comes to commission or offers of compensation in MLS, that field will no longer be available in MLS, meaning that any and all discussions pertaining to buyers, agent compensation will be negotiated directly with the seller and their agent. So what does this mean for sellers? Well, as a seller, you can still offer to pay the buyer's obligation to the buyer broker if you choose. The benefits of doing so are that you actually lower your capital gains obligation. It lessens the financial burden on buyers, which opens up your potential buyer pool to many more eager and ready buyers. And lastly, in my opinion, you'll likely have a buyer who is represented by a professional realtor, and that presents less risk to you as they are more likely to perform on their end of the transaction. Now, sellers can also elect to not pay the buyer's broker compensation, and let's talk about what that will look like. Not offering compensation to a buyer's broker places the obligation in the buyer's court, and this is where the buyer's broker compensation agreement takes effect. Some of the cons of not offering commission to the buyer's broker are that a buyer might not be able to afford to pay the commission, in which case you likely lost that buyer. Depending on the market you're in, the pool of buyers that can afford to pay their agents may be smaller, so you limit your potential buyer pool. And there will likely be a number of discount brokers who will offer their services to buyers for a reduced or even a flat fee. However, the representation they might receive could be subpar, which may put the transaction at risk of not going through. Lastly, the capital gains you'll pay will be higher. Now, the buyer at this point will have some options, and I'd like to talk about that here for a minute. Option number 1, the buyer pays for the agreed upon buyer's broker compensation out of pocket. Option 2, buyer can still request the seller to pay the buyer's broker's compensation, and the seller can decide at that point if they would like to consider it or not. If, for example, the seller agrees to pay 1% to the buyer's broker, and the agreement you signed has 2.5% as the agreed upon commission, the buyer will still be responsible for the additional 1.5%. Option number 3, buyer can include the buyer's broker compensation as part of the loan. Lenders offer certain percentages as concessions, which a buyer can use for various closing costs, and buyer's broker commission can be defined as a closing cost. It's important that you speak with your lender now so you understand the financial implications on your current or future pre-approval allowance, as this may impact the purchase price you qualify for. Now, the last piece I want to touch on is how open houses will be conducted moving forward. There are now a handful of forms for agents hosting open houses as a means to identify the agency relationships so there is no confusion or implied agency between realtors and buyers. The first form is called the Open House Visitor Non-Agency Disclosure and Sign It. This form is a sign-in sheet that states in bold letters that agent does not represent the visitor, communication with agent at the open house property tour for the benefit of the seller, communication with the agent are not confidential, and the final 2 line items are specific to if the visitor writes an offer on the property or would like the agent holding the open house to represent them as their buyer's agent. This form clearly defines the role of the agent at the open house so there is no confusion by either party. The second form is called the Buyer or Tenant Non-Agency Agreement. This form states in simple terms that there is no representation of the buyer by the seller's or the landlord's broker. another more direct form clarifying the agency relationship so there is no confusion. There are 2 checkboxes in the form that allow the buyer to state whether the buyer or the tenant is represented by another broker or not. It also states that the, quote, seller/landlord broker will act as the agent of the seller/landlord exclusively during any negotiations or transactions regarding the property. I think you see where we're going with this now, don't you? The last form I wanted to touch on is called the Property Showing and Representation Agreement. This form is for agents and prospective buyers who want to see properties but are unwilling to sign a buyer-broker compensation agreement. This allows the 2 parties to work together on up to 3 properties in a non-exclusive agency relationship. The representation period in the form is limited to 3 months, specifies how the broker will be compensated if the prospective buyer enters into contract on the property, and defines what the specific broker involvement levels are defined as. There's also a section in the form which defines how the agreement can be canceled either on receipt or a certain amount of days after receipt. One of the highlighted sections on the form, specific to prospective buyers, mentions 2 scenarios: buyers attending an open house without representation and all other prospective buyers. It's critically important that you as a buyer read these 2 points carefully before signing the document. So if that wasn't enough of a reason for you to want to commit to working with the buyer's agent, let me share another one with you. If you don't have a buyer's agent, you will not have any insight into pocket or off-market listings, and one of those could potentially be the exact listing that you're looking for. Buyer's agents work for you. They negotiate in your best interest, and we have access to off and pre-market properties that you likely wouldn't know about otherwise. Well, I hope you found this video helpful in illustrating the changes that are happening now in the real estate industry. The situation is still fluid and constantly evolving, and as we learn and know more, I will share that knowledge with you. But as of now, this is the state of the industry. Hopefully you learned something, and like I mentioned earlier, feel free to share this around with anyone you think might find this helpful, whether or not they're in the market to buy or sell real estate. I'm Ricky Flores of the Margo and Ricky team with Sotheby's, and remember, who you work with matters. Give me a call, and let's work together to achieve your real estate dreams.